Hello, good afternoon. In this class, we are going to have a orientation with the nerve physiology. So, nerve physiology, as the nerve name says, it revolves around the understanding all about nerve structure and function. Going by the structure of a nerve fiber. Nerves are actually the axons that leave the central nervous system. These are what is like a nerve fiber. A typical nerve fiber or a neuron comprises of this following structure. So, it has a well defined cell body with a prominent nucleus in it, and in the cell body, this is the cell body, and in the cell body there are presence of this rough endoplasmic reticulum, and which has got the ribosomes, which we call as the nasal granules. And also there are certain organelles like the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, all those are present. Now, from a widened area just leaving the cell body, there is like the initiation of the axon. This widened area, which is known as the axon hillock, which then forms the main structure, which is the axon. Now, axon further spreads out to terminal region, which is receptive in nature. This is the axon terminal, and this is the axon which is having the exoplasm. On the either side of the axon lies the covering with the sheath, which is called as the myelin sheath. Now, it is not that all axons are covered with myelin sheath. There are cells both in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system which has this covering of this sheath, which is the myelin sheath. These are the myelin sheath. The gaps between the myelin sheath is the node of Ranvier. These are the nodes of Ranvier. This is what and how a typical nerve fiber look like. A myelinated nerve fiber. Now, coming to the function of a nerve fiber. First and foremost thing to remember about the nerve fibers are that nerve fibers are excitable in nature. Means what? They undergo depolarization. They get excited. Another thing is that they generate impulse. And when we talk about the impulse, we talk about the electric impulse that is generated due to certain change in the ionic concentration inside and outside the cell. We'll come to that soon. They generate impulse. They can conduct the impulse. Now, conduction of the impulse is a very important physiological function of a nerve fiber. Now, when whenever any stimulus or impulse flows through a nerve fiber, it releases neurotransmitter. Very important function of a nerve fiber. Whenever there is any impulse that is passing through the nerve fiber, it will release neurotransmitter. Now, this neuro this neurotransmitter may be excitatory or inhibitory in nature. This is the main function of a nerve fiber. It may generate an impulse, but it has to conduct an impulse. Okay. Now, understanding certain electrical property of the nerve fiber. Electrical property of a nerve fiber. What is the electrical property of a nerve fiber? To start with that, to understand the electrical property, we have to start with the concept of resting membrane potential. So, what is a resting membrane potential? The term resting membrane, meaning when the cell is in the resting condition, not excited. So, it is the difference in charge in the outside and inside of the cell when it is not excited, that is in resting condition. Okay, the difference of the charge which is existing outside the cell and inside the cell. We have studied that the cation and the anionic composition of the ECF and ICF is like same, but the quantities vary largely. Like if this is a cell membrane, this one, say this is a cell membrane of a nerve fiber. Now, we know that the sodium is a predominant outside in the ECF, and in the ICF, the predominant cation is potassium. Now, when the cell is in resting condition, it is seen that the outside of the cell is positive in charge compared to that of the inside of the cell. It does not mean that only positive ions or cations are present in the ECF. No, but the amount of the positive charge that is outside the cell membrane, which is facing the extracellular fluid, it is more than the amount of cation or the positive charge that is facing the internal side of the cell, that is inside inner leaf of the cell membrane in the resting condition. So, this is what is in resting condition, resting membrane potential. Now, what makes this resting membrane potential, or why there is this resting membrane potential? Reason is that the conductance of potassium, that means flow of potassium from ICF to ECF is very slow. Okay, it is very slow, as a result of which there is only sodium which is more in the ECF, and potassium, it is present in the ECF, but it is more in the ICF. So the positivity is more on the outside compared to that of the inside. This is one reason. Another reason is the sodium potassium ATPase. What we have seen here, the coupling ratio is 3:2, meaning this ATPase comes out 3 sodium molecule from ICF to ECF and pumps in 2 potassium molecule from ECF to ICF. So every time there is a net gain of one positive charge in the ECF side of cell membrane. Okay, this is also one reason. Another reason which contributes to the resting membrane potential, that the positivity is more in resting condition, the movement or conductance of sodium from ECF to ICF is almost nil. It is like very minimal. It's like almost nil. So all these factors makes the outside of the cell more positive compared to that of the inside of the cell. This is what is the resting membrane potential. It is a difference in the charge that is due to the unequal distribution of the cation and anion across the cell membrane. Okay, now coming to the action potential. Now, how is a action potential studied? Action potential is studied by connecting two electrodes to a big axon. Then the electrodes were connected to the galvanometer. Okay, the electrodes were then connected to the galvanometer. Now, upon stimulation through the deflection, this are like change in the difference in the charges, this action potential is detected. So, how does a typical action potential look? A typical action potential. Okay, 2 points before that, need to remember resting membrane potential of a nerve fiber is usually minus 70 millivolts. This is something we have to remember. So now, if we are drawing the action potential, so this is on the x-axis, time in millisecond, okay, and this is the action potential amplitude in millivolt. Therefore, upon stimulation, okay, say this is the resting membrane potential and the excitable cell is at minus 70 MV. There is a slight rise. After that, there is a upward spike followed by a downward spike which further lagers below, and then it gets back to the same time. Okay. Now, what are the components of an action potential? To write it, components of action potential. Okay. So, here, suppose this is where the stimulus was applied. This is where the stimulus was applied. This is the time where we saw no response. So, this time is the unresponsive time, which is the latent period, means the period where there has been no generation of any response. Then initially another 10 minus 10 like 10 to 15 millivolt, there has been a lagering or very slow increase this stage. Okay. So this is the lagering or the slow stage. Then what we get is an upward spike which surpasses the 0 point and goes all the way to maximum positivity. In this case, let's assume it is plus 35 millivolt followed by a downward strike. So the upward slope is the depolarization wave, and the downward is the depolarization wave. So this is the depolarization and this is the repolarization. What lags or lagers below is the hyperpolarization. It is the hyperpolarization. And then it straightens out as resting membrane potential. Goes back to the resting membrane potential. So if we write the components of an action potential, we have the depolarization, which is the upward stroke, Then we have the repolarization, which is the downward stroke. Now, this depolarization and repolarization together, we call it as a spike. It is called as a spike. Now, this spike touches maximum. Spike reaches maximum 2 plus 35 millivolt. Now, after this, what happens is the hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization. Okay. After that, it comes back to the resting membrane potential. Now, here there is the lagering behind stack, like some lagering thing, right, until it reaches minus 55 MV. So, this is called as the local potential. What we will do is, we will study the ionic basis of all these stages one by one, starting with the ionic basis of, let's start with local potential. Okay, what is the ionic basis of local potential? What is actually happening? Now, ionic basis of this local potential is that here only a few sodium, rather voltage gated sodium channels open. Okay, only a few voltage gated sodium channel opens. That's why here there is no spike, only there is like small increase. Now, another characteristics of local potential is that local potential can be depolarizing or hyperpolarizing. Okay, like it can cause an action potential, like the reach area before it can cause an action potential towards upward, it can also be downward also. Now, ionic basis of the first stage, that is the depolarization. Upon stimulation, many voltage gated sodium channels open through M gate, and it causes influx of sodium. Okay, so during depolarization, what we see, this is, say, the membrane. Okay, here I'm drawing only single line. This is ECF and this is ICF. So during the depolarization, this is sodium channels. Okay, so during depolarization, there is opening of this voltage gated sodium channel and there is sodium channel influx of the sodium through the sodium channel. now comes the next stage, that is the repolarization. So what happens in repolarization? When the influx stops. Influx of what? Influx of sodium stops after 1 to 2 milliseconds. Then potassium efflux, rapid potassium efflux starts in the repolarization phase. So sodium, through sodium channel, sodium has entered and then now sodium channel has closed. Like the scene is something like this. This is the cell membrane, ECF, and this is a ICF. So here you see, suppose the sodium has entered. Okay, the sodium has entered. Now during repolarization, the sodium channel has closed. So there are now many sodium. So since the sodium channel is closed, it cannot go out. So there is too much of positive charge inside the cell, which will make the cell very unstable. So what happens next is, immediately to bring back the resting membrane potential back to the normal, what happens? The potassium efflux starts through the potassium. So potassium channel. So the positive charge is like excess positive charge is now thrown out of the cell in form of K plus. Na plus has entered, make the cell more positive. We get the upward spike. As soon as it touches the maximum level, the sodium channel closes, but too much of positive charge in the cell. So how to get rid of the positive charge? Sodium gates are open, so sodium can't go out. So potassium now starts going out and gets rid of the excess positive charge. That is potassium efflux happens. Okay, as simple as that. Now, what happens in the third stage? Third stage is hyperpolarization. Now, what is hyperpolarization? Here actually, the ionic basis is slow efflux of the potassium through the potassium channels. The slow efflux of the potassium through the potassium channel. Okay. Now, what happens here? The sodium channel, it opens via the M gate and closes via the H gate. So here it closes via the H gate and then the efflux of the potassium starts. Now, the opening and closing of the potassium channel is not as fast as that of the sodium channel. So here what happens? Here there is very slow potassium efflux. So this slow potassium efflux is actually causing washout or causing loss of more positive charge than it should happen. Therefore, the prolonged and prolonged and write it clearly, slow efflux of potassium causes the resting membrane potential to be hyperpolarized. Okay, it causes like the resting membrane potential, instead of going back to the resting membrane potential, it causes like more negativity. It becomes more negative than -70. Instead of coming to -70, it goes actually down below -70. This is the reason for this hyperpolarization. After hyperpolarization, again the resting membrane potential, it comes back to the resting membrane potential with the help of sodium potassium ATPase. So this is the ionic basis of action potential of a nerve fiber. Now in nerve fiber, this action potential is very. Now in context to this action potential, point to remember, it is seen that the speed of conduction of action potential is higher in a myelinated nerve fiber. Okay, so if a nerve fiber, this is say the axon, and these are the myelin sheath, the wraps of the myelin across the axon. So if there is presence of myelin sheath, then what it is seen? The conduction. The conduction of impulse happens from node of Ranvier to the node of Ranvier. Okay, it is like of the jumping type, So this type is called the saltatory conduction. This type is called the saltatory conduction. This type of conduction of impulse is called the saltatory conduction. So it is higher. It is like rate of conduction is faster in a myelinated nerve fiber. So on the side, we will also remember few more points related to the conduction. And we'll go back right to the action potential, other things right away. Are the properties or essentials for conduction of impulse across a nerve fiber. What is it? It is axon diameter. So, if the axon diameter is large, then the speed of conduction is speed or velocity is more. So myelin sheath is one factor. Axon diameter is another factor. Another important factor is the temperature. Okay, that is the temperature. Okay, so at higher temperature, the speed of conduction is faster. So at higher temperature, the rate at which the impulse is conducted is faster than that in the lower temperature. These are the points to be remembered on the side. Okay. Okay. Now coming back to the action potential. What are the other properties of action potential or characteristics of action potential in a nerve fiber? So, properties of action potential. What are they? Number one, action potential follows all or none law. Means if a stimulus is given, then either there will be action potential or there will be no action potential. So, upon stimulus, either there will be an action potential or there will be no action potential. It will never be like half has happened and half is not happening. No, it will never happen. It will never happen. Okay. Second is that threshold stimulus. For full action potential, a stimulus of threshold intensity is needed. Sub-threshold, like if the stimulus is less than the optimal stimulus, sub-threshold stimulus will not generate any action potential. It will not generate any action potential. Similarly, supra-threshold stimulus will not generate a full amplitude action potential. Okay, this will not happen. Now, the third important characteristics and a very important one is the refractory. Now, understanding this refractory period is very important and it is of lot of implications also. Refractory period means it is the period when no action potential is generated. Okay. For example, suppose there has been like a stimulus. Okay. And say that stimulus has generated a full action potential. Okay. So this is the wave of depolarization. This is the repolarization. Okay. Now it is seen that until and unless 1/3 of the repolarization, this is the time and this is the action potential in millivolt. So it is seen that until 1/3 of the repolarization phase is over, even if a threshold level stimulus is given or a supra-threshold level stimulus is given, there will be no generation of action potential. This region is called as the absolute refractory period. Okay, so this is the period in the action potential during which if a very strong stimulus is also given, yet there will be no generation of another action potential. Okay. After that, the remaining part, there is like the part from here to the end of the action potential. This is the relative refractory. Now, what is relative refractory period? Like after this 1/3 of the repolarization is over, after this dotted line region is over, if a strong stimulus is given, then there can be generation of second action potential, but maybe it will not be as big or as mature as the previous action potential. So, absolute refractory period, this is the period where a strong stimulus cannot generate a second action potential. This is absolute refractory period. Whereas relative refractory period in this period, a supra threshold or threshold intensity stimulus can generate action potential. Now, what is the significance of it? Why should the nerve have such property? What did we study? Nerve, each and every nerve fiber, it does not lie without any termination, right? Yes, there are some free ending of the nerve fiber, but that is different. We'll come to that. Nerve fiber goes and innervates a structure or the other. So, what is the importance of refractory period? Now, nerve goes and innervates a structure. So, when nerve is excited, it releases a neurotransmitter which is usually excitatory in nature. There is inhibitory on nature also, but it depends on where it is located. So, when it is excitatory in nature, a stimulus that passes or the action potential that passes through the nerve fiber and innervates the structure, it will cause contraction of that structure. Okay, usually it will cause the contraction of the structure. So here, refractive or refractory period or refractory phase, okay, refractory period helps to stop premature contraction of muscles. Like usually it prevents conditions like twitch or tetanus or spasm. This is like spasm is a different thing. Twitch or tetanus, this kind of phenomenon, this refractory period stops. Otherwise, it would have caused that one. Now, in context to this properties of the nerve, there are two other properties of a nerve fiber. Okay. Accommodation and adaptation. What is accommodation and adaptation? When a sub-threshold level stimulus is given to a nerve for a prolonged time, then the nerve fiber fails to generate action potential. Now, this happens due to inactivation of voltage gated sodium channels. Okay, and this phenomena, this phenomena is called accommodation. Accommodation. On the other side, adaptation is like when a single supra threshold stimulus is given for continuous period, then adaptation happens. That is no action potential. Now, why does it happen? This happens because the sodium channels becomes unresponsive. So adaptation and accommodation are two characteristics of a nerve fiber. So these are the properties of a nerve fiber. What can be the types of action potential? So what we have seen is a monophasic action potential. Are the types of action potential. Now, some action potential can be biphasic action potential. Like it can be both above and below the line. Okay, the action potential can have a wave both above the isovolumetric line like this one and also below the isovolumetric line. So it is called the biphasic action potential. Similarly, there can also be a compound action potential. So what is a compound action potential? When a mixed nerve fiber means like mixed nerve fiber, like a bunch of nerve fibers which are both sensory and motor. These are both sensory and motor in function. So what can they do? They can show like two peaks. Say this is like the stimulus, that there is a stimulus. So in the compound action potential, there can be like some fibers showing an action potential like that, and from there itself maybe another type of action potential is generated. or it can also be something like this, like one action potential is completed, which is without being separated immediately, there can be depiction of another action potential. So these are called compound action potential, which is seen in a mixed nerve fiber. Okay, these are the other type of action potential. Now coming to the clinical or implications of the action potential. So, the clinical implication of action potential. So, what was action potential or what is action potential? If we have to say the definition, just a reminder by going by the definition, what does action potential mean? So, action potential is the redistribution of charges, that is the cations, that happen across the nerve fiber membrane upon stimulus, right? That is what is the action potential, and we have seen the phases of it. We have understood the ionic phases of it. Now, what is the clinical implication if there is any electrolytic imbalance in the body? The cation, the anion, it has to all be in a normal optimal condition. So due to any reason, the values of the sodium, potassium, chloride, all this thing goes up, and calcium, very important cation, all this thing goes up and down. What will happen to the action potential? Okay, this is what we will understand one by one. Right? Electrolyte in hypernatremia. Okay, hypernatremia. So what happened in hypernatremia? What is hypernatremia? Here actually, here the sodium concentration in the ECF increases. Whenever we talk of this electrolyte imbalance like hyper or hypo, just like how we studied the Darrow-Yannet diagram yesterday, similarly here also this fluctuation in this cation means the fluctuations in the ECF, not the ICF. Okay, because ICF we know directly we can't measure also. So hypernatremia, it means when the sodium concentration in the ECF has gone up due to some reason. What will happen? So sodium, as it is more in the outside of the cell, right? Compared to the inside of the cell. So if its concentration becomes even more outside the cell, it will not have any major effect on the action potential. Only what may happen is the size or amplitude of action potential may increase. Like normally, just for our understanding, I'm drawing. So normally, suppose it is supposed to be like this. In case of in case of hypernatremia, natremia, the same thing might be like bigger. Okay, this is the only difference. The amplitude may be bigger. This is the first case. Second case, just the opposite, which is hyponatremia, means in ECF, sodium concentration is less. So what will happen? Just the opposite. Here, the action potential amplitude may increase. Like in normal condition, if it is like this, in hyponatremia, the amplitude will go down. This is the only thing that may happen. Let's talk of hyperkalemia. The third thing, hyperkalemia. Here the ECF potassium level increases. Here the ECF potassium level increases. Okay. Now let's understand what may. So this is the ECF and this is the IC. So in normal condition, what do we know? Usually in normal condition, potassium is more in the outside compared to more in the inside compared to the outside. Now in case of hyperkalemia, what will happen? There will be much more potassium in the ECF side, right, outside the cell membrane. So there will be less tendency of the potassium to go out of the ICF. In normal condition, what happens? There is leaky channel. Through it, there is always like little bit of potassium that is trying to go up. But when there is more potassium outside, and why do we say going out? That connects to what theory? That connects to the law of diffusion, passive diffusion, which we studied like 2 lectures back. Passive diffusion means what? When due to the concentration difference, the movement of the ion happens from a region of higher concentration to lower concentration. So in normal condition, what happens? Potassium is more inside. So through the leaky channel, there is always a tendency of the potassium to go out. But in hyperkalemia, when the concentration of the potassium is already more in the ECF, the potassium that usually goes out from ICF to ECF, it will not happen because potassium is already more outside, right? So now there will be positive charge potassium accumulated inside the cell. Now, what will this do? This will make the cell more excitable. It will make the cell more excitable due to more potassium induced positivity inside the cell, as a result of which action potential will happen faster at a threshold stimuli. Okay. So again I repeat, because if we understand this one, the opposite is for hypokalemia. So hyperkalemia means what? When there is more concentration of potassium outside the cell. Means the cell membrane that is facing the ECF. Now when this is facing the ECF, what will happen? In normal condition, what happens? Potassium is less in the ICF. Potassium is less in the ECF, it is more in the ICF. So from ICF, it has a tendency to go to the ECF through the leaky channel. Now, since in hyperkalemia, the potassium is more in the ECF, then there is no pressure gradient. There is no inequality in the concentration. Like ICF is not having more than ECF because it is hyperkalemia, means more potassium in the ECF. So, whatever potassium is present in the ICF that is inside the cell, it will stay inside the cell. It will not leave the cell. So, the potassium will cause more positivity. Like if the resting membrane potential was like minus 70 MV, now due to accumulation of potassium, it will become like minus 65 MV. So, the resting membrane potential will become more positive, cell will become more excitable, and with little bit of threshold stimulus, the action potential will happen very faster. This is the hyperkalemia. If we have understood hyperkalemia, we can connect to hypokalemia. ECF potassium level drops. As it is even in normal condition, the concentration of potassium is higher in the ICF compared to the ECF. Now, in case of hypokalemia, this concentration drops even less. It becomes even more less. So when it becomes even more less, then what will happen? Then there is like more less of negative charge outside compared to the inside, right? Because here as ICF has more K plus, that is the gradient increases more in hypokalemia, then what will happen? Potassium efflux, because the concentration is more in the ICF, to ECF will increase. So the ICF will have less positive ion, the inner membrane will be more negative. So the negativity inside the cell even will be more, because following the concentration gradient, the potassium is now going from inside the cell to outside the cell, because the potassium is now very less in the ECF, but it is same in the ICF. So now potassium will have more efflux to the leaky channel, from inside to the outside. As a result, the inside will be now more negative, and the resting membrane potential will be more negative. So, the excitability of the cell will be less. What cell? Nerve cell, nerve fiber here. That is also a cell, right? And action potential will be slower. Means it will take like little bit more stronger threshold intensity to generate the action potential. Okay, this is the what will happen in imbalance of the potassium. Another important condition is the hypercalcemia. Now, what will happen in case of hypercalcemia? Now, calcium that is ECF, calcium level increase. Now, in normal condition, what is the scenario? In normal condition, this is the ECF, this is the ICF, this is the cell membrane. So, in normal condition, the calcium level is more in the ECF compared to the ICF. Now, in case of hypercalcemia, the calcium is like much more. The calcium level increases much more in the ECF. Now, we know for each and every function of the cell other than renin secretion and parathyroid hormone secretion. So, this is another like short thing and a quick thing to remember. Always remember this, you have to remember for rest of your life. Other than renin secretion and formation and parathyroid hormones, other than these two, for all cellular functions, may it be transportation, may it be any kind of metabolism, contraction, everything, secretion, everything, calcium is needed only in the renin secretion and also in the parathyroid hormone synthesis. Now, in case of hypercalcemia, the concentration of the calcium becomes much more in the ECF compared to that in the ICF. So, here what happens, the calcium that is needed inside the cell is less. So, less calcium in the cell renders the nerve cell less excitable. It renders the cell less excitable. So all the body function, cellular function will slow down because calcium is not adequate in quantity, and calcium is not a cation that can easily diffuse across the cell membrane through some channel, leaky channel or anything. Calcium always enters through voltage gated channel. So it cannot come through leaky channel like the potassium and the sodium. Okay, sodium also has, but few in number. Maximum it is the potassium, which maintains the resting membrane potential, as we understood. If we have understood the hypercalcemia, we can easily talk about the hypocalcemia. So hypocalcemia, what does that mean? Hypocalcemia, it means when the concentration of calcium is less in the ECF, it goes down. So the concentration of calcium is now more within the cell compared to that of the outside the cell. So more calcium inside the cell makes the cell more excitable. Okay, it makes the cell more excitable. So action potential will be faster, and here the action potential will be slow. Okay, So these are the properties of action potential, which is related to the properties of nerve. We have understood the structure of a typical nerve fiber also. So this is all for today. Tomorrow we will study the classification of nerve, nerve injury, and the classification of nerve fibers, the nerve injury, and also we will understand the degeneration and regeneration of a nerve fiber. So see you all tomorrow evening. Thank you.